Here's some Nevada-specific questions. Have you ever wondered why Nevada classrooms are consistently overcrowded? Or why they can't solve a persistent teacher shortage? Or maybe even just boost reading and math scores? Well, can I interest you in a little topic called funding? Well, I guess specifically it's the Commission on School Funding, but we'll get into it. This week, we get into why Nevada has been historically so bad at funding education, and if anyone plans to do anything about it. From Battleborn Progress, this is Battleborn Bites. My name is Jacob. Class is in session. School funding is obviously not a new issue for anybody, and in Nevada, I'm sure you've already heard this issue if you've lived here for any amount of time.
How do you expect us to teach with these supplies? Well, this pointer's so old it's worn down to a nub.
It still points, doesn't it?
But just to set some baselines here, even though Nevada is the 31st largest state, the Clark County School District is actually the 5th largest school district by the number of students in the country. It's behind only New York, LA, Chicago, and Miami, and one of these things is not like the others. But despite that size, Nevada has lagged the average national funding per pupil for decades. Just for context, right now, the national average is about $17,600 per student. In Nevada, it's only about $13,300 per student. But we can't really talk about Nevada's education system without talking a little bit about Nevada's history and the fact that for a long time, there really weren't that many people in Nevada. And Nevada is also very large. It's so large. So in the 1860s, after Nevada becomes a state, they're just kind of vibing their way through it and just decide that, if we need to set up a school district, you can have 10 families write in and say, we need a school district. And they're like, okay, school district, cool. Ultimately, every county has a superintendent managing all this, but there's no limit on the number of total school districts. The consequence of all this? Well, in 1865, there are 23 school districts for about 1,300 students. Forgive me, I need to read these numbers directly because there's a lot of them. But in 1880, there were 109 school districts for 7,300 students. Well, 20 years later, there were still 7,300 students. But guess what? 231 districts. Sure. Why not? In 1911, the legislature recognizes this as a huge mess and attempts to fix it, but they didn't really fix it because the legislature also attempts to fix it in 1915, 1925, 1937, and 1947. So, bang up job, everyone. So by the mid-50s, everything is still a mess. So in 1954, Nevada has 207 districts for 35,000 students, which is a lot of districts still. Only 173 of those districts were actually active, and only 158 actually had one school operating in them. So awesome. So in 1955-56, they create the school system that we understand today. Every county gets one school district. That's it. We're not doing 200 school districts again. But this creates a fun, uniquely Nevada conundrum because Clark and Washoe counties, which essentially means Las Vegas and Reno, are growing way faster than everywhere else. So now the question is, how do you equitably distribute funding for schools if most of the students are only concentrated in two places? I also must impress upon you that the demographics of Nevada are radically different in the mid-50s. Nevada is 90% white. And look at this map of Las Vegas. You'll notice Henderson is represented mostly as an abstract thought off in the distance. How did they fix this problem? Well, it was called the Nevada Plan, which would be very boring as all school funding formulas are, except for the fact that they didn't change it for 50 plus years. I guess it was 52 years by the time they finally got around to it, but that's a spoiler, I guess. Now, the Nevada Plan does one thing really well. It gives everyone a level playing field to work off of and sort of flattens the regional differences that might emerge because people only live in one of two places for the most part. But critically, the money's got to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is taxes, obviously. But in Nevada, when we talk about education funding, we're really only talking about two funding sources for the majority of the state's history. That's sales taxes, or the local school support tax, and property taxes. Now, the precise number for each of those taxes and how much they funded education over time bounces around a lot. But Nevada, for decades, had one of the highest shares of local school support versus state school support in the country. Now, this all mostly works for a while, but by the 2010s, everyone starts to acknowledge that the Nevada Plan is starting to crumble under its own weight, especially, as we mentioned, with Clark County becoming so large between the 1990s and, well, today. So enter the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, which is a very long name, so I'm just going to call it the PCFP from now on. I know this is all very exciting. I think it's really exciting, but the way that the PCFP works is it takes all the education money the state gets from stuff like like property taxes and local support taxes, but also stuff like mining taxes, marijuana taxes, room taxes, you name it, and puts it in a big bucket and says, this is for education. Later, it gets all redistributed out to everyone through like weights and tiers and stuff. Again, as I said, all very exciting. But the interesting thing here is that the PCFP ties the state's education budget to the actual budget. So if the actual budget gets bigger, then it mandates that the education budget has to get bigger too, and never by an amount less than inflation. As a result, in 2023, when it finally kicked in, it injected over $1 billion per year into the state's education funding. Neat. Less neat, the per-pupil funding gap still exists. Nevada is about $4,000 per pupil per year behind the national average. And it turns out that's not going to change without a new plan. Does such a plan exist? It does, as a matter of fact. Basically, every legislature and governor has known in some variety that the school funding question is a difficult nut to crack, and school funding sources have always been one of the most difficult nuts to crack. Just uncrackable, the uncrackable nut. But here's a fun fact. The legislature in 2019 actually created a nutcracker, or kind of one, I guess. It's called the Commission on School Funding, and it does what it says it does. They were tasked with coming up with the specifics for the PCFP, the new funding formula for K-12 education in Nevada, but more specifically, they were tasked with coming up with recommendations for getting Nevada to meet that average per-pupil funding in the next 10 years, or what was called optimal funding. And you better believe this report exists. It's 500-something odd pages, but it exists. You can read it. And if you really want to, we've linked some of these documents in the description below. And you may or may not be shocked to learn that following inflation isn't enough to actually close the gap to the national per-pupil funding average. Now, everyone from the commission to the legislature to the governor knows that none of this money is going to be injected immediately. So the commission laid out a potential 10-year phase-in process where you would increase funding by about $200 million-ish in the beginning, with that increasing over time to about $300 million-ish per year at the end of that 10-year process. If you want a big flat number, the report talks about $2.6 billion in new funding over the next 10 years. And to be clear, that is extra money we are currently not spending and does not exist. To actually do that, they've laid out a very comprehensive process of proposals that could include messing with all kinds of taxes and what are called abatements. That's all very complicated and I've linked it below. But for a quick TLDR, the reality is the state just needs to modernize its tax system. And very specifically, it needs to modernize its property tax system. Because, and here's another fun fact, the state hasn't touched its property taxes since 1983. If anyone wants to date that in their heads, Every Breath You Take by the Police was topping the charts. So, a little Sting reference. Got a little Sting in there. But the idea that Nevada's tax code and revenue structures might be antiquated and ill-equipped to handle, say, a changing economy is not a hypothetical question. It's something that people are dealing with right this second. Just for starters, it's probably not a great sign when news outlets are running stories like, "Will Nevada's budget be busted?" Things get slightly worse when you consider that such budget busting is only starting to account for the way that something like flailing tariff policy is impacting the state's tourism economy. And those budget projections actually get catastrophic once you account for the $1.9 billion that could be lost if congressional Republicans decide to cut Medicaid, as they are strongly considering literally right this second. So in that environment, what are state legislators willing to do? What's Governor Joe Lombardo willing to do? At this point, I would caution everyone not to get their hopes up. I mean, just for starters, Governor Joe Lombardo earlier this year submitted an initial budget that had a $335 million hole in it, so take from that what you will. But he has also been very anti-new tax in media appearances, very no new taxes, very George H.W. Bush coded if we're being real.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
And here's another wrinkle. In Nevada, for any kind of tax increase, you need a 2/3 majority. And Democrats, even though they control the legislature in both houses, they have a supermajority in neither. So it would have to be a bipartisan effort. It becomes a real who wants to fall on the sword kind of deal. It's a big hurdle, to be certain, but it's not an insurmountable one, and history has shown us that. So in 2003, Republican Governor Kenny Gwinn actually ushered in what was then the largest tax hike in the state's history in order to basically save the state budget from becoming insolvent, and in the end it was a $1 billion shot in the arm, and extremely controversial. Then in 2014, Governor Brian Sandoval ushered in the actual largest tax increase in state history with the commerce tax. That was a tax for businesses who made over $4 million per year. But in both cases, it's important to note the state's budgets were in crisis and political leaders spent their political capital to solve the crisis. At the time, they were pariahs among members of their own party. Gwynn briefly faced a recall effort, and there were multiple attempts to try and get rid of the commerce tax while Brian Sandoval was still in office. But now we're faced with this, with tariffs and the economy more precarious than any time since COVID or the Great Recession before that. It's fair to say that the state's budget and the state's schools are in a crisis. So now the only question left, will the state's leaders have the courage to follow the recommendations they asked for and pass the plan outlined by the Commission on School Funding? Well, that is a question with an answer that we are going to find out at some point, and that point might be sooner rather than later. But that does it for this week's episode of Battleborn Bites. If you like what we're doing, like and subscribe so you're the first to know when we upload a new episode of the show. Until then, from Battleborn Progress, this has been Battleborn Bites. We'll see you next time.